Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Da, 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 da. Hey guys,
Siberia.
Nolegia, awesome channel, love it. Preemptive like. The original link to the video, top of the description. Below that, link to the Discord. Would love to have you. My name's Connor. I like to watch and learn things. Let's go.
Is almost Siberia is almost like a land of legend. Its extreme winters and vast uninhabitable landscapes have made it akin to the fantasy of the North Pole in the minds of many. Yet, unlike the North Pole, Siberia is in fact a part of Russia, which in turn has given Russia a similar reputation for some foreigners. But Siberia hasn't always been a component of any nation, and since it's technically a part of the Asian continent, it can be a bit confusing as to why it is now considered by many to be European. So, how did Siberia become a part of Russia anyway? The first known mention of Siberia in Russian literature comes from a piece written in 1407 telling the account of a Tartar by the name of Khan Tokhtamish who was murdered in the Siberian lands. Additionally, there are earlier Novgorod chronicles of expeditions into a place called Ugria, which appears to be the early name for the region of Siberia. The Grand Duke of Moscow would eventually conquer Novgorod and therefore inherit any lands that the Novgorods had taken deep into the east, though a vast part of the region was still under the control of local Tartar Khans. Some would serve as vassals for the Russian Tsars, while others refused, and there was a bit of back and forth for some time relating to who really controlled the Siberian lands. At the time of these early conquests, the Tsardom of Russia included a people known as the Cossacks.
Nolegia, I feel like you've even stepped up your game even further. This map is amazing.
Conquests.
Love it.
The Tsardom of Russia included a people known as the Cossacks, an East Slavic Orthodox Christian people who originated in the steppes of Eastern Europe. In the late 16th century, some of these Cossacks decided to try their hands at expanding their own territory, and one man in particular, Yermak Timofeyevich, was determined to make this happen, gathering a force of over 500 Cossacks alongside additional Polish, Lithuanian, and German mercenaries. These troops followed him into Siberia, where they ran into the native establishments, which were already subjects to Russia's neighbor, the Khanate of Sibir. During 1581, the Cossacks marched through the new territory, slowly but surely overpowering the local towns and people. The Russians didn't just waltz through unopposed, though. Many of the local Tartar people launched counterattacks and retaliatory raids on the invaders, and they put up a valiant fight. Nevertheless, the Cossacks marched on. Their next goal was Iskar, the Siberian capital. After clashing with the forces of the Siberian Khan Kukum and his Tartar allies, the Cossacks eventually took the capital in October of 1582, despite continued Tartar resistance. Kukum had temporarily retreated into the steppes, but he returned in the late summer of 1584 with a spectacular ambush of Timofeyevich's.
Guys, it shows you like just how much this goes for, the Himalayas for sure, with India and China being, India and China are such different culturally different nations, and yet they're very close, but they just have such a dividing range. And you can see it's not only that it's difficult to cross over, but also all of the rivers that they use to navigate. Rivers obviously flow from high elevation to low elevation. So the precipitation accumulating in the Urals is going to fall down on either side of the Urals. And so the tribes on either side are going to have rivers flowing away from each other. And it's so interesting how areas of the planet can be such dividing of cultures. Does that make sense?
Kukum had temporarily
like over here is probably so much more similar to way over here, than like right here is to right here. You know what I mean?
Retreated despite continued Tartar resistance. Kukum had temporarily retreated into the steppes, but he returned in the late summer of 1584 with a spectacular ambush of Timofeyevich's troops. The Cossacks were caught off guard and utterly routed, and Timofeyevich wouldn't make it out alive. Following this defeat, the few surviving troops retreated from the capital as the Tartars laid waste to the entire city. It took 2 years for the Cossacks, now boasting additional military support from the Tsar, to return to the capital, or what was left of it. The locals were once again overpowered by the Russian firearms, and the Cossacks were able to start making some more permanent establishments in the region, such as their fortress at Tumen, not so far from the capital they had so recently took and lost. Over the next few years, as the Russians continued to clash with the locals, Kukum managed to escape capture again and again, even after a significant defeat by the Cossacks at the Battle of Urmin in 1598. However, the Khan's family members were captured during the conflict and were taken back to Moscow to be kept as hostages, which had a remarkable impact on the future of Kukum's political and military life. He eventually ended up in the south of the Siberian region with the Nogai Horde. From there, Kukum attempted to negotiate with the Tsar, asking that he be able to at least acquire some land near the Irtysh River, but this was swiftly denied. In reply, the Tsar instead invited the Khan to join him in Moscow to comfort himself, but Kukum was too smart to take such bait. After the Khan's death at the start of the 17th century, the Russians continued their expansion throughout Siberia, building forts and outposts as they went. They initially even tried to push further into Asia, but upon running into equally powerful artillery and military at the Chinese border, they decided that this would be the extent of their expansion. Nonetheless, the Russian borders were being extended by millions of square kilometers over only a few decades. By 1640, the entire Siberian Khanate and more had been brought under the Russian Tsardom in what would now collectively be known as Siberia. And while this was vastly impressive from the Russian perspective, it was not quite seen the same way by the Siberian natives. The Cossack invasion and subsequent conquest of Siberia had a similar effect to those seen in other conquest or colonization efforts around the world. Disease spread rapidly among the natives. Smallpox in particular was one of the worst due to
Interesting. I know that the smallpox was devastating for native North and South Americans, right? But I thought that's because geographically they've been isolated for thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So in the main old world, Africa, Asia, Europe, where people had been in contact and sharing germs and diseases, I figured that if you're on the mainland here, you'd come in contact with that and would be more resilient. But even just shows you how isolated these people are, even when connected. It's so cold and everything.
to its high rate of transmission and death, and in some populations, it is believed to have wiped out roughly 80% of them, as
Jeez.
these viruses wreaked havoc on the natives. Whilst the warfare did similar damage, the resistance to the invaders grew weak at a rapid pace. Initially, the Cossacks showed somewhat of an effort to resolve the issue of pushback through negotiation, but in the case that the locals refused to submit to the Russian Tsar, the Cossacks would respond with violence. Some of the native population took to warfare as well, hoping to expel the Russians from the region. This resulted in a series of particularly rough rebellions in 1706, 1731, and 1741 by the Itelmens, who were repeatedly beaten down by the Russians due to the severely inferior weaponry of the former. The pushback from the better armed Koryaks beginning in 1745 and lasting over a decade proved to be much more challenging for the Cossacks to stamp out, but eventually they were able to do just that. The Chukchi may have been the strongest and most difficult native resistance for the Russians to overcome. Throughout the mid-18th century, they were in near constant battle with the Cossacks and often won. While these conflicts were usually fairly small, and in turn, the number of Russian casualties was not great, the Tsar was still infuriated by the Chukchi resistance. In 1742, a decree was issued by Empress Elizabeth advising the Cossacks to attack the restless Chukchi with an armed hand, eradicate them completely. It wouldn't take long for both disease and warfare to once and for all put an end to the native rebellions and secure Russia's hold over Siberia.
When did they get Alaska?
But why did they even do any of this to begin with? Why did they want Siberia? Well, the main reason was probably due to one thing: fur. In the early Novgorod expeditions throughout Siberia, they had quickly realized that the natives had valuable furs that could be sold and traded for great profit. This also explains why the conquered native vassals were required to pay their tribute in furs. The motive proved to greatly enhance the Russian economy and increase its revenue in response. Essentially, the Cossacks knew that although Siberia was populated at the time of their invasion,
So a very similar reason why the French and English wanted to conquer more and more of Canada, right, for fur.
it wasn't so densely inhabited that they would be unable to wear down the insufficiently equipped locals. And this would be worth their effort because they knew that the natives had a surplus of furs that could be taken for the Russians' own gain. Once the Tsar became aware of all this, it was only that much easier for the Cossacks, who had the state's support, and the usefulness of the newfound fur trade and revenue greatly benefited the Tsar himself. The war with the Chukchis was not quite as good of news, and the Russians likely didn't see such a significant obstacle coming until it hit them in the face. And although they were eventually able to overcome it and solidify their Siberian rule, this disruption nevertheless cost the Russians money and resources they would have preferred not to use, and time they could have better spent selling furs. Still, the Russians came to Siberia with the goal of creating a lucrative fur trade, and they did just that. They also greatly expanded the Russian borders along the way, seizing the region of Siberia that still remains a part of Russia to this day. The reason how Russia was able to conquer this vast land is in part due to the Cossacks' superior weaponry, particularly in the form of firearms and artillery, and also the fact that the population in this area was so small and many were unprepared for war, whereas the Russians had such experience and the ability to easily replenish worn-down forces. The disease wreaking havoc across the native population additionally aided the Cossacks in their campaigns, and the fact that there was really only one Khanate to oversee the whole of the fragmented region meant that military resistance would be manageable. Once the Siberian Khanate did collapse, it was merely a matter of time before the remaining native populations would either be subjugated or eradicated.
Really great video. Love Nalegia. I gotta go get some breakfast. Lunch, I mean, Jesus Christ. It is 3:30. All right, hope you guys are all doing well. Would appreciate any comments, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.